Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.
We're here today with Elizabeth Savage, who is a poet and a teacher in Evansville, Indiana. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hello, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Good.
So today we are going to talk about modernist manifestos. So these are various essays, polemics that were written in mostly the early 20th century. And they're kind of like introducing a philosophy of breaking with the past artistically and politically and in some other ways. You read some of these essays. So what kind of general trends do you see in some of them?
Well, actually, interestingly enough, I might see a trend to, at the time where they're writing, and say that it's similar to many of the statements artists are currently making. And that is to rage against the machine, if you will, and to assert a voice that is otherwise marginalized among art and artists. So Mina Loy, for example, asserts herself as a woman and doesn't step back from any of the implications that might have. And similarly, Langston Hughes asserts himself with a Black voice, writing for not only a Black audience, but in his mind, a united audience. And again, I would point to here we find ourselves 100 years later grappling with similar conversations about art and what that might mean for us.
I was kind of surprised in revisiting some of these at how kind of right-wing some of them are, particularly Marinetti, who was really associated with Mussolini's fascist movement early on. And of course, Ezra Pound also famously aligned himself with the fascists during that time period, and was even arrested for treason by the United States, right? And Mina Loy was associated with Marinetti's movement, kind of like, but I think broke with them when they started to align themselves with the fascists, right? But even her piece is what we would today consider a more conservative view of feminism and the importance of motherhood. She uses phrases like, she talks about like the white race suicide.
I think one of the things I would caution us about is to be careful of presentism. And that is to say, to try to consider the art in its own time. Certainly it must have been a scary time, right? Life is changing very, very quickly. We leave romanticism behind, we head into modernism, and that transformation is more than just a transition of time periods. I mean, life is changing for us so quickly. As we talk about, does art imitate life, or is, life imitating the art? And the marriage of those two things, I think, is what you're bringing up with Marinetti, for example. How do I live in a problematic time and not have those problems creep into my art?
Mm-hmm.
Right? As I'm trying to make sense of the world and the changes around me, it's going to creep in. And I think, again, I hate to keep like harping on the things that we're going through right now, but I've had to set my own creation aside right now because I don't always want the pandemic to have any thread at all in some of the work that I'm trying to create. And so I think when you have things like fascism or feminism, or even with Langston Hughes and his assertion of a Black voice and trying to discover what that is, they can't help but include artifacts from their time.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I would say that Willa Cather and William Carlos Williams in this batch of essays kind of stand out as really trying to look at a new way of writing specifically
Yes.
compared to the others, are more explicitly political, I say, in a lot of ways.
Yes, and in talking about the word manifesto, for example, we can't help but discover it and put it in its roots, which is, the Communist Manifesto, which is probably the most popular or common way that students and all of us learn about that word. So when writers adopted that word, they're either asserting their own voice, like Hughes and Loy, or asserting a voice for a collective, which is more like William Carlos Williams. Another kind of thread of an idea of a manifesto, or the assertion of the writer's own way of writing, or their approach to it, or their metaphysical thoughts about their own art, is ars poetica. And so those two, the manifesto and the ars poetica, then have a very close relationship in terms of the creation of art. And so while she doesn't call it that, Nina Loy, for example, we might make the argument that parts of it are an ars poetica, like, right, the discovery of the art of poetry.
I thought it was interesting that Willa Cather, in talking about the ideal modern novel, she uses Dickens, of all people, as her exemplar.
I think one of the interesting things for American writers, especially in this early time, is that many of them brought with them small library collections that they had when they crossed to settle the States. And those small library collections were passed down generation to generation and were often very, very important to them. And they include the classics and then, their own, best-selling authors like Dickens.
Right.
And so it's interesting when you find those connections. We're coming right off of our own Civil War, like, to put it on a timeline of what we're talking about here, just after the turn of the century, we still have people living in the 1900s who would have been affected directly by the Civil War. We still have people who would have remembered things that seem to us, right, so long in the past. And so these modern writers are at a turn of a century, much like we found ourselves in the year 2000, commenting on where we've been and where we intend to go. The manifesto has as an intent to bring art from the margins of society. So if we imagined in the Renaissance, art would have been everywhere, right? Artists creating and writers writing. And that became not the case. So you have that issue with the development of the manifesto. And the second issue you have is the center of poetry / art. And that is already at that time, lofty journals and institutions and the development of a canon, and writers feeling as if they are not welcome, and trying to tear down those gates, which is why I said Rage Against the Machine, right? They're trying to assert themselves as like, no, I am creating art as well, and here's what my art's going to look like or sound like, or what voices I'm including. If I'm not speaking for myself, the other voices that I bring along with me in my art.
That's deep.
Well, here's another, like, we don't have an established culture, right? In the United States, still to this day, there's no established culture. We also don't have a well-developed sense of taste, right? So, like, things are decidedly French, and French people agree what is French. Yeah, that ain't happening in America, right?
At least, yeah, especially not 100 years ago. Yeah.
Right.
There's, and you know, it's only started kind of to define itself, to try to define itself a little bit earlier than this with like Emerson and Walt Whitman
Yes.
trying explicitly to begin to define what an American culture and American literature would look like, right?
And so that thread carries through. And then when you have things like, well, right on the heels of a pandemic, because Marinetti publishes in 09, and then just 10 years later, they have their own Spanish flu pandemic. We've got World War I. We have, as I mentioned, life is changing. It's changing fast. So this still this thread of what does it mean to be an American, right? What does American art look like? What is decidedly American? And women and Blacks and whoever are part of this and need to have a seat as we hammer out what is art. And we're going to break down these gates, and we're going to say that we don't want art to be on the margins of our society. We want it to be in the nucleus.
Cool. Well, I think that is probably all the time we have for Modern Manifestos today. So thank you so much for Zooming with me.
Thank
and
you.
We'll see you soon.
All right.
Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.